Kia ora, everybody. Just wait one more minute just so everyone can sign in and connect up. All right, kia ora koutou, ko eila barefoot aho. Haere mai, and welcome to our third hot take session. Today we have an amazing panel here to talk to us about chemical footprints. This topic came about as the business Bioking, who are a member of our network, got in touch with me about chemical footprints and how they're trying to raise awareness of synthetic chemical use by businesses. I was intrigued by this, as we've all heard lots of talk about our carbon footprint, but I'd never encountered the term chemical footprint. So this hot take was born. I've got a panel of experts from our network here today to kick off our learning. From the University of Auckland, we have Senior Lecturer and Deputy Director of the Centre for Green Chemical Science, Dr. Cameron Webber, and Senior Lecturer of Chemical Science, Dr. Erin Leotao. Then we have Kristelle Basson from Bioking to give us a business perspective. So thank you all for your time and being here today. But before we kick into the panel discussion, I just want to give you a bit of an introduction to explain about what a chemical footprint actually is. So initially, it's important to make the distinction between chemicals and synthetic chemicals. Everything is made of chemicals. Water is a chemical, so we need to be careful not to demonize this term. Synthetic chemicals are man-made and are created using methods that are not found in nature. So a chemical footprint is the total mass of chemicals of high concern used by an event, organization, service, building, or product. This system was created for the same reason as a water or carbon footprint, because what isn't measured cannot be managed. So I know that chemicals can seem like a daunting and really scientific area of sustainability. So today we're going to try and break it down into something we can all understand. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and pop any questions you have for our panel in the chat as well. Otherwise, after the panel have presented, we'll open up to a Q&A session, and then you can pop on your microphone and video if you like and ask the question directly, or while they're speaking, feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll get to them when I start. So now I'm going to hand it over to our panel to get this hot take started. So first up, we have Cameron.
Kia ora. Sorry, I was trying to find the button. Thanks everyone for coming. And I just wanted to give an overview of the chemical footprint of clothing and some of the, I guess, chemical impacts that can arise from clothing, mainly because obviously clothing is something that's going to impact all of us at both a professional and an industrial level, but also on a personal level as well. And certainly if you're in an industry where you're dealing with uniforms or protective equipment, this can be something that can be quite significant. And so I was already given a good overview of part of the reason that we're focusing on synthetic chemicals. Just one extra, I guess, point to add to this is one of the challenges with synthetic chemicals is because they are often quite new and not found in nature. Some of the impacts that they can have aren't really discovered until often quite late in the process after they're being used at quite large scale. Whereas a lot of the natural compounds that we are introduced to, we've had quite a long period of time and exposure to them. So we sort of get a good feel for which compounds are particularly problematic and which ones are safe to use. And so the textile and clothing industry is quite a large user of synthetic chemicals. So over 8,000 different compounds are used. And some of these are in areas that you might not necessarily expect. So if you think about growing fibers, you have synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides that are involved in that process, through to fully synthetic fibers, where of course the entire fiber is actually made from synthetic chemicals. Then after you actually have the fiber or the fabric, the processing involves usually several bleaching steps to remove any colorants and different different compounds that may be found either naturally or from the synthetic process, and then dyeing steps to add color. And then ultimately, before the clothing item's finished, there's usually a range of different finishings or coatings that could be applied. Things like water-resistant coatings, fireproofing or fire reduction additives that can have significant chemical footprints as well. And then if we think about actually using the clothing, and this will be kind of more in our personal experience, you also have things like detergents used for washing the clothing and chemicals that are used for dry cleaning. And so all of these add to the overall chemical footprint of even relatively common items of clothing. I guess one of the main reasons that we don't often think about chemical footprints, particularly for things like clothing, is a lot of the chemical impact is happening offshore. Most of the production of these fibers and fabrics and the dyeing stages are happening often in developing countries. And so we're not seeing the side effects or the impacts of that chemical use directly. So I'll go through a few examples along the chain of clothing production where these chemicals can have impacts and the types of compounds that could be used. And so one of the misconceptions is often that if you use a natural fiber, that it's going to have a lower synthetic chemical footprint. And that's not necessarily the case, particularly for things like cotton is actually quite a chemical intensive, or growing cotton is quite a chemical intensive industry, at least how it's been conventionally grown. It uses a huge amount of insecticide in particular. So it accounts for about 2% of total cultivated land, but about 10% of global insecticide use. And then another issue is that actually dyes tend to be less readily fixed to cotton compared to synthetic fibers such as polyester. And so that means that, again, you start increasing the chemical footprint because you're leading to much higher emissions of dyes as part of the wastewater. And we'll come back to dyeing in a second. Whereas some of the chemical impacts can be a little bit more self-evident. So of course, if you're dealing with purely synthetic fibers, which are derived from petrochemical-based products, a lot of the chemical footprint and chemical use is coming from the actual production of the fiber itself. You then have things like the semi-synthetic fibers like viscose and rayon. And so these often involve chemical modification steps, even if they come from things like cellulose, which are relatively readily grown and have relatively small chemical footprints in terms of their growing stage. The synthetic modification of things like viscose still requires the use of compounds like carbon disulfide in the actual manufacturing of the fiber itself. One of the sort of emerging fibers that's been touted as an environmentally friendly sort of alternative to many of the synthetic fibers, but also as an alternative to things like cotton, has been lyocell, which some of you may be familiar with. And this comes from effectively hardwood forestry plantations. And unlike things like viscose, where there's a chemical modification of the fiber, in lyocell, you're actually taking the cellulose fiber and just reconstituting it into into the clothing material itself. And the way that they're able to do that is the use of a solvent which is actually able to dissolve the cellulose. The problem is that there's relatively few solvents that can do that successfully. And the solvent that's used commercially is actually quite highly hazardous. It's toxic to reproduction and inherently relatively harmful. Most of that is recycled and reused, so the actual impact to the environment is minimized because the recycling processes are relatively efficient for this. But it does represent a potential risk because, of course, that there are accidents can happen, or no storage and recycling processes are over 100% efficient. And so you're still using hazardous compounds in the production and manufacturing of these fibers, even if they're not from petrochemical origins. The other major chemical impact of clothing production comes from the dye and coating stage. And so the textile industry accounts for about 20% of all industrial wastewater. And a lot of that comes from the dyeing stage, because of course, once you've dyed the clothing or dyed the fabric, Usually there's an extensive washing process to remove any dye that's not that isn't fixed on the fiber. And there's an estimate about 280,000 tons of dyes are discharged in wastewater. And if you think about what the usual concentration of dyes tend to be in that wastewater discharge, they tend to be quite low, which means that there's actually quite a substantial amount of wastewater that's produced from this process. And while the clothing that you get at, that we would be using at our end will tend to have very low concentrations of dyes because you don't need very large amounts of the dye to produce the color. When you're dealing with it in high concentrations, then there are quite a number of different health impacts that can arise. And there's reported quite significant rates of bladder cancer in those working in the dye industry because of the hazardous nature of some of the chemical dyes that are used. But also some of these dyes are discharged into wastewater and not fully treated before being added back into waterways. And so that can cause problems with for populations that are living near these waterways that are being used for the release of this wastewater. And I guess as a final point here as well, that some of these waterproof coatings and oil and grease-proof coatings for high-performance clothing applications use what are known as forever compounds. So these PFAS, so fluorinated PFAS type compounds, and Erin will talk about those in a second. So I won't talk too much about this, just that they are present in a number of clothing items. So without being too doom and gloom, obviously it's going to be important to think about what can we do about this? What are some ways that we can try and minimize our chemical footprint when it comes to clothing? And in terms of minimizing the amount of hazardous synthetic chemicals that are used, or hazardous chemicals overall, there are 3 different accreditation groups that deal with the textile industry. And all of them look at a sort of holistic approach to an item of clothing. So they're not just accrediting the fiber or the fabric. It includes things like fastenings, buttons, and so on as well. And they all have, relatively transparent lists of the types of compounds that they will check for. And they're usually relatively extensive. So if it's accredited by Oikotex, GOTS, or Blue Sign, that's usually a good sign that the hazardous chemical use has been minimized throughout the production process for that particular item of clothing. And of course, the biggest impact that we can have, or the biggest way that we can reduce the production or use of synthetic chemical, hazardous synthetic chemicals related to clothing, is by reusing or recycling our clothing items. And this is something that as a society, we're not particularly good at doing at the moment. So less than 0.5% of all textile waste is actually reused as clothing. We have a not insignificant, so about 12% that's recycled as other fiber or fabric applications. So that could be using them as rags, it could be recycling the PET from polyester and using it for manufacturing new plastics. But very little is recycled as clothing. And we still end up with about 87% of our sort of raw clothing material that ends up being lost or landfilled rather than being reused. And so the more that we can reuse that, and the more that we can also reduce our demand for clothing items, the lower the overall chemical impact is likely to be. And in New Zealand, so there are companies locally that are looking at solutions for this. So Usefully is a company based out of Wellington. And so they are aiming to try and repurpose and reuse and minimize minimize the amount of clothing material that we actually require. And so they work with companies to both look at their the overall impact of some of their end of life processes related to clothing items, and also to work with different partners to be able to actually come up with solutions for reusing them rather than simply landfilling all of these used clothing items. And here are just a couple of examples that they've used so far, where they've taken things like Air New Zealand uniforms and converted them into recycled PET plastics, and using different overalls and fabrics as rotting cellulose options as alternatives to imported cellulose. So there are companies, if you're involved in, and particularly if you're dealing with things like uniforms, where you have a lot of very similar garments that you have to deal with at their end of life, this is one approach that you can look at to try and minimize your both carbon and chemical footprints by giving those clothing items a sort of extra life at the end of their use. So just to sum up, I mean, the key point is that there are synthetic chemicals that are important and implicated in all of the different stages in the life cycle of clothing. One of the big issues is that this is largely out of sight, out of mind, because it's often happening in developing countries, not locally. And so it can be something that's often forgotten about. And it's also much more difficult to measure because we're dealing with a large number of different chemicals rather than things like carbon footprints or water footprints, where it becomes a sort of slightly easier task to measure. But approaches such as certification and recycling and minimizing clothing use are some ways to help reduce the chemical footprints in these areas. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to, relating to clothing in particular, I'm happy to answer them at the end of this.
Kia ora, thank you so much. Yeah, a really good intro. I like that. Being able to talk about clothing is something that relates to everyone, and especially that business sense of the uniform. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or wait till the end and we'll get to them. We're also going to chuck a link. We have at SBN a circular economy directory, and that has some of those recycling kind of clothing and uniforms, ways to do that as well if you're interested to look into that. But we'll pass along to our next speaker first. Erin, you want to jump in?
Great, can everyone see that?
Perfect.
Okay, kia ora koutou. So I'm Erin Leotao, Senior Lecturer at the School of Chemical Sciences in the University of Auckland. And I am going to follow on Cameron's trend here and talk a little bit about the complexities of measuring a chemical footprint. In particular, just giving you a perspective of a class of chemicals, which he mentioned already, PFAS. Just a second. Right, there we go. So I'm just going to reiterate what the Chemical Footprint Project is all about. And so the chemical footprint, as already mentioned, is focused on the chemicals of high concern. And so the aim is to then produce other chemicals or use other alternatives, maybe not chemicals or synthetic chemicals, in order to reduce the use of these chemicals of high concern. And so I would like to just start by posing a couple of questions. The chemicals of high concern, I mean, some of them are very obvious. But how is this decided? What is required in order for a chemical to become high concern? And when we look at safer alternatives, one thing to ask ourselves is, how can we be sure it is a safe alternative? And hopefully by the end of the talk today, you can have a little bit more information on that. So I'm going to start with what are PFAS. Many people do not know what these are. And so if you fit into that category, don't worry. Lots of chemists don't know what this is even. So PFAS are a really large class. So there's over 4,000 manufactured chemicals, but over 9,000 known substances that would fit within this class. And the key here is they're perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances. But for you, what I want you to think about, so if this is the structure of one of them, you can see these balls here. So the black ball is a carbon and the green one is fluorine. And so there's a number of these carbon fluorine bonds present in these molecules. Okay, and this tail in the molecule is really good at repelling water, oil, and grease. So you can imagine the applicability of some of these like really awesome properties that these provide, right? So they're used in aqueous firefighting foams. Your raincoat is likely coated with some PFAS. Microwave popcorn bags are big. The inside are coated so that you don't end up having that grease escape your bag when you're putting it in the microwave. Fast food containers, same idea. Personal care products are a big one, actually, that people didn't really realize until a lot later. And across many different sectors. So we have the construction sector and packaging, and then obviously all of these consumer items as well that we're coming in contact with. So as mentioned, these are chemicals of high concern. Cameron called them forever chemicals, and this has been the name that they have had because they have these really strong CF bonds, so they stick around for a really long time. This is one of the strongest bonds. It is the strongest bond to carbon that we know of for a single bond. And so in order to break those down, you need really high temperature processes or really clever kinds of remediation technologies. And what they do is they are persistent, so they're mobile, they are persistent in the environment, and they bioaccumulate. So once we get to certain levels, they can become quite toxic and lead to adverse health effects. So in a human, they accumulate in our bodily fluids as well as in our organs, and a number of studies have shown how bad they are. In particular, if you have sort of direct exposure and you're involved in the sort of manufacturing side of it, or in the site of where the manufacturing is eliminating waste and ending up in the groundwater. So the mobility of these is very high, and you have your waste processing, which goes into soil and leachate and groundwater. You have your point sources where they're manufactured or some kind of products are manufactured using these, ending up in ground and surface water. And then of course you have your wastewater facilities as well. And then all of these kind of come together, and we're ingesting these in the foods that we eat, in the water that we drink, in the air that we breathe. So it's really quite a big problem. In terms of how this chemical class kind of came about, I would like to just show you this timeline. And you can see that they were first sort of synthesized in the 1930s and 1940s. So we're talking many years ago. And then to become commercially manufactured, that started around 1950. And you'll see that, I think Cameron alluded to this in his talk as well, often these are manufactured on a large scale before we have any idea what's going on in terms of health concerns. And so they were already happening for 40 years before we realized that actually this could be a really big problem. And so you'll see how the track of sort of alternatives started to come in after we realized there's health concerns. And this is kind of alongside or in parallel with the environmental detection and sort of the analytical technology that we have in order to determine where these are and what's happening to them as they move through our environment. And so even though manufacturing was sort of being eliminated for some of these substances earlier, 2010 to 2015, one thing I would like to point out is these are considered long chain. So the chains that I showed you had about 8 carbons containing fluorine atoms. But what has happened initially in terms of alternatives is that those long chain have just been replaced with shorter chain versions. So they still have a lot of carbon fluorine bonds. They are still considered PFAS. And this was just to circumvent sort of the regulated compounds. And I'll show you what that looks like a little bit here. So there's been a really big increase in attention as you go down. These are the first 2 that were regulated, and I'll give you the numbers in the next slide. And so that was where the initial attention focused. They were the most widely manufactured and found to be the biggest problems. And now we're increasing our attention to widen this out to the whole class of PFAS. So don't worry so much about these different names. That's just the way that those of us chemists can shorthand them. But the key is that they have these carbon fluorine bonds. So regulation has happened. It's underway, but it is really hard to keep up. So in 2000, it was announced that PFAS, so this is only a subset of PFAS, would be withdrawn from sale. And then they were restricted along with their derivatives from production and use in 2009. So you can see the kind of gap in time frame. And there has been some exceptions or exemptions for some of the compounds that are difficult to replace or just remove. And then in 2019, PFOA, so this is another class of derivatives. So now we're talking about hundreds of compounds that are now restricted. But remember that there's thousands of these. And so then earlier this year, so like I mentioned, the sort of 8 chain is what gives the O in these names. And that one was initially restricted to these 2 classes. And then this HX is actually the 6-member chain. So that one earlier this year, which was a substitute originally for these ones, has been added to the list. And that was because it was regrettable. So this has been found to be also a chemical of high concern. In New Zealand, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants has been implemented in 2004. And our regulation of PFOS was a couple years later, and PFOA and derivatives 1 year later as well. A couple of exemptions can still as we phase them out. And we heard earlier this year that New Zealand is the first country in the world to regulate PFAS in all firefighting foams, and that's to be put in place by 2025. And so here we have, PFOA being regulated, and here's some versions that are new, but are not that class of regulated compounds. And so this leads to the sort of never-ending story of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances as shown here in this paper, because we're just trying to keep up. So these ones need to be tested, and there needs to be some product stewardship looked at before some of these other ones end up on the market. So I'm going to just take you through this little case study here. A recent paper earlier this year in Environmental Science and Technology. And bear with me, I know this looks pretty weird for most of you, but what it is a study of 93 consumer products marketed for children and adolescents. And that's within 3 classes. So apparel, furnishings, and bedding. And so things that you would come in contact with on a regular basis. So they've taken these 3 different groups, and they've looked at the labels and all of the details they can for those different products, and have been able to associate them into 5 label groups. And that's these here. So some of them were trademarked as water and stain resistant. So in those cases, we would expect to observe PFAS in these. There are some that are water and stain resistant with no trademark. Again, this is a pretty big indicator of the presence of PFAS, so that we would expect that in that class as well. And then we have the water and stain resistance claims plus green language. So eco, green, non-toxic was also used as part of the product label. And so in this case, you would not expect to see PFAS because of these other claims. There was also green language certification, no water stain resistance claims, so you don't expect to see PFAS. And similarly, if you just take the water and stain resistant out and may or may not have green assurances in this class that doesn't, again, you wouldn't expect it. So if we look at this figure here, so this is sort of the threshold of the particular technology. And what is being measured here is something called total fluorine, which is a non-targeted analysis. So it's looking at kind of the whole class. So anything that kind of has a carbon fluorine bond can be detected in this way. The main way that we do testing, though, is called targeted analysis. And that's where you have a library of known compounds, and you're directly checking whether or not those compounds are present. And that library is not very large. I mentioned there's thousands of these compounds. Well, the library is in the tens of what we're looking at. So less than 100 is sort of the best case scenario. But that allows us to have a more quantitative analysis of whatever is going on. but is probably not capturing everything, as you can see here with this study. So the one that is, of course, the one we want to be concerned about is the one in the middle here. So this is the one where we have water and stain resistance claims, but green language. So you're buying these products thinking they're eco-friendly and non-toxic. But look at how much, in some cases, we have up to 1,000 parts per million of PFAS present. This is maybe more nicely depicted in this other graph here, where they show the extractable PFAS detection frequency. So this is your trademarked example. This one has water and stain resistant claims. And then this is the one that is the middle one here with the green labels. And then, of course, these are the no water or stain resistant. So we don't see much in that space. So what's going on here is, are they lying to us? Do we have problems with these alternatives coming in that are proprietary, so we don't actually know that they're in there? When we're certifying things, are we certifying it against a library? So when we have regulated compounds, so PFOA and PFOS, those are regulated. You'll notice in some products it'll say PFOA free, but likely that's actually a red flag rather than something that should make you feel comfortable, because if it's just saying PFOA free, then it probably has some shorter chain one there. So what we're really after in this space is something that says PFAS free, so the whole class capturing everything. But that can be quite challenging because PFAS are everywhere. So they are in drinking water and in makeup, as I alluded to earlier, even though they are unlabeled in those different products. So waterproof type makeup is possibly a flag there. And then in food packaging, even though some of the companies say they phased them out, they may still be there. We have found some in New Zealand. So as I mentioned, they bioaccumulate. So there was a dolphin study looking at New Zealand dolphins. And even though we don't manufacture PFAS in the country, we do find it in surprising concentrations in our dolphins, as well as earlier this year in our urban waters in New Zealand. And last week, there was a study that looked at rainwater, and it demonstrated that it's actually everywhere on Earth. And so these chemicals being so mobile, irrespective of where they're being manufactured, they're ending up on, the top of Mount Everest and in polar bears and in our rainwater. And so the time to actually remove these was, right away when we had product stewardship. But I guess the question is it enough to just remove all intentionally added PFAS if we're having, detectable concentrations in our rainwater? And we know that these bioaccumulate. Right, so that's it for me. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of from a chemical perspective, I guess, some of the challenges with determining a chemical footprint. If you'd like to get in contact with me, here's my email. I would also like to mention that I'm part of a wider network of people looking at PFAS from a number of different angles. And so if you're interested in joining our discussions, we're having these on Zoom every month. So just give me an email and we're happy to put you on the list. Also, I would just like to flag that there are companies in New Zealand and sectors that are really interested in the chemical footprint from PFAS and thinking about PFAS, and that's the wool sector as well as the packaging sector. So people are becoming more and more educated in this space. So that's it for me. I'd be happy to answer any questions when we're at that time of the session.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Erin. That was really, really interesting. And yeah, great to hear from that really scientific perspective. It can seem a little bit overwhelming for people like me who aren't super scientific, but you broke it down really nicely. So thank you for that. Shocking and scary, but while we're on that kind of wave, I'm going to pass to Kristelle to give us a really uplifting story of a business who's kind of pretty concerned with this problem as well and has started to create their business model around finding a bit of a solution for one area of this. So pass it along to you.
Thanks, Isla. Hi guys. So I am from Bioking. Bioking was created with desire to change the cleaning industry. So when I say changing the cleaning industry, because the cleaning industry in New Zealand has got a fairly high synthetic cleaning chemical footprint. So Bioking was created with that desire to say, what can we do different? How can we do different so that we can leave the planet in a better state for our next generation? So that's where Bioking comes from. Bioking is a probiotic-based cleaning solution. So it helps companies to reduce their chemical footprint in the cleaning sector. So I'm just going to play you guys a short video. Hope the sound works.
What if we could change the way we clean? From harmful chemicals that impact all living on planet Earth to probiotics. Cleaning by Mother Nature with the power from plants and healthy soil. How is it that these small microbes, known as good bugs, can clean? Just like they keep our gut healthy, fighting off bad bacteria, producing essential enzymes to digest food. They are the perfect cleaning machines. They consume organic dirt, make enzymes that will continue to break down dirt. They move across surfaces, make more of themselves, and form a protective biofilm. Bioking, the home of sustainable cleaning solutions. Developed with sustainably sourced probiotics, we offer you the ability to reduce your chemical footprint today. Your cleaning should not dirty the planet. Contact us to discuss your solution. Bioking, cleaning by Mother Nature.
So that's just a short little introduction. So to do this, a little bit of doom and gloom, since the 1950s, there's been at least 150 new synthetic chemicals that has been introduced into the cleaning chemical industry. So, and only a fraction of these have ever been tested on human toxicity. And that's a little bit scary to think that we use it every day in our businesses and in our homes. So I actually, just on Monday, this amazing article came out that was from the umatter.world website that I follow quite a bit, that we have reached the planetary boundaries on chemical pollution. And probably in about February, there's another link here that was from The Guardian that actually had an article on the same level of pollutions that we have going on worldwide. So for us at Bioking, there's a very, we like to discuss the inconvenient truth about traditional cleaning. This is something that nobody ever looks at or nobody really speaks about. So for us, there's two parts of this. It's the environmental impact and the health impact. So on the environmental impact, yes, a lot of people are looking at different ways on how to look after the planet, and we're looking at your carbon footprints in different areas of sustainability. But not a lot of people realize that the amount of chemicals, cleaning chemicals that we use in New Zealand. So just in the New Zealand schools can contribute up to 150,000 litres of cleaning chemicals, water cleaning chemicals into our wastewater. The commercial cleaning industry adds about 350,000 litres a month. And then we don't even know what the household numbers is because we can't really track that. And all of these are affecting our ecosystems. So, and then the other side of it, we've got human health. So the human health part is that we are exposing the vulnerable, we are exposing aged care or people in aged care, but also our children, because allergies, autoimmune diseases, asthma is all on the rise, and we all run to the doctor and we're not realizing that there's other impacts that's causing this. And then the most important part of this is all of these commercial cleaning chemicals or cleaning chemicals are contributing to antimicrobial resistance. So antimicrobial resistance, I need to share a little bit more information on that. So antimicrobial resistance is actually considered by the CDC as a One Health problem. So it affects humans, animals, and the environment. So the overuse of antibiotics has got a very big part of that, because in the US, more than 47 million unnecessary prescriptions are written. And in New Zealand, the health department is actually helping doctors and educating people that don't overuse of antibiotics. And the reason for that is that the microbes is actually becoming stronger. So we've got microbes inside our bodies, everywhere around us. It's from nature, it's supposed to be there. But we are making them stronger by using products that kills all the good and the bad, and then leaving a void for the ones that are left behind, because most cleaning products says 99.9% cleaning, but the ones that are left behind can multiply every 20 to 30 minutes. And within 24 hours, you can have 2 million viruses or bacteria on a surface, and they just become stronger than the product that was used to try and kill them before. So antimicrobial resistance is the microbes that we live with that is becoming stronger on a daily basis because of the traditional way that we're trying to kill them. So in Australia and the US, there is strategies that they are creating with how to combat AMR, and the New Zealand Health Department also has a whole section on their website on things that we can do to actually reduce that. Last year, there was an article on News Hub that we are facing fertility issues in men, and that is linked to chemical exposure. So when we look at different types of chemical compounds, a lot of people go, yes, we're going green, but we have to look at the sustainability that is considered in the whole chain of production. And Erin and Cameron spoke about this earlier. It's easy to say that I'm using a peroxide type product, but how is that product actually made? What is the footprint from it being produced all the way to when it gets to in your hands for you to use it? Many products is more of a, has a greener label on it. Most of these cleaning chemicals is just diluted, so you need to use more of it to get the same effect. And all these are accumulating, and they all end in our wastewater, and that is a negative effect on our antimicrobial resistance. So traditional cleaning chemicals versus a probiotic solution, there's a whole list that I can go through of what the differences is, but something I want to just highlight is on the part of odor. Odor is caused by bacteria. So anytime that there's an odor, it means there's a type of bacteria. And today you go to the supermarket, you get air freshener because something doesn't smell nice. It just masks the odor a little bit, but it doesn't actually do anything about it. When you use something like probiotics and you spray it on an area that has an odor, let's use a carpet for an example. When the probiotics actually land on the carpet, it's in a spore form, in a sleeping format. As soon as it finds there's food around it, it comes alive, and it actually starts encapsulating the odor-causing bacteria. So number one, the smell is eliminated or reduced significantly. And then secondly, the probiotics actually start eating the food source of that bacteria and then eats the bacteria itself. So it actually eliminates the odor completely by removing its food source. And it does that on many things like mold and issues with protein in urine, all of that. So just a quick summary. So the biggest thing for us as a company is that looking at a solution that was innovative and that we could use something that we found in nature on a daily basis. So something that is really important to us is looking at a product. Chemicals, traditional cleaning chemicals is there for a certain reason, but we do not have to use it every single day on every single thing. When we kill the good and the bad, it means that the bad gets stronger. So we keep the good, make the good strong to keep it a healthy, balanced environment that we like. We now actually have a machine called a fogging machine that you can spray on a very large area, let's say in a big lecture hall or a big canteen, that you can spray the floors, use a flat mop to mop the floors. There's no buckets of water with cleaning chemicals that's going down the drain. And then the best of it all is a lot of businesses and even households struggles with dust. Dust is 70% skin cells, and that means that it is everywhere in your business. So dust is one of the favorite foods for probiotics. So when you spray probiotics cleaning solution in your business, the probiotics will actually keep on eating the dust. And it means that over time, if you've got a healthy colony in your business, that you will actually notice that there is way more dust than there used to be. So for us, it is all about changing the way we've done things so that we can look to the future and have a product that does not impact the environment. That's something that's really, really important to us. All our products come in a concentrate because we don't ship water. We make sure that all our applicator bottles are reusable, that we do not use any single-use plastic. So Isla will share my contact details and you're more than welcome to ask any questions.
Kia ora, thanks so much for that. Great to hear about a New Zealand business working away at trying to help with this issue. So what we're going to be doing now is a little bit of a Q&A. So there's a couple in the chat I'll get to in a moment. Otherwise, if you'd like, feel free, you can use the reactions bit at the bottom to raise your hand if you want to pop your camera on and ask a question. But yeah, super interesting, a good kind of broad overview, just dipping our toes into this topic. But the first question I have is, why do you think that this is obviously such a huge issue, both for the environment and for health, yet it's less talked about than a lot of other sustainability issues like carbon or water use?
So I'm happy to have a go at that first, if that's okay with everyone else. Yeah, so I think, I mean, I guess we've mentioned this indirectly a couple of times, is I think one of the challenges is just how to measure it. Because of course, with carbon footprint and water footprint, you've got a fairly clearly defined, you're looking at one specific compound or one specific, type of resource and how much you're using. With chemical footprint, one of the challenges, of course, is that not every chemical is hazardous. So there are some things that shouldn't be included in that, and there are also degrees of hazard as well. And so it's working out where to draw some of those lines, and there's some definitions that now exist about what can be defined as hazardous and what isn't. But also because it is a complex area, it's much more difficult to quantify, and I think that's part of the issue. And I guess as Erin, I think, and maybe Kristelle as well, have touched on, there are some issues with proprietary information if you're dealing with suppliers that are preparing compounds and you're taking those and further manufacturing them. You don't necessarily know the origin of everything that's become part of the process. Yeah, that's
great.
my perspective.
Thank you. We have a question here from Tim Street. He's asked, who enforces chemical regulations given it's a worldwide issue? Are they being equally applied in all countries?
I can have a go at this, I guess. I am not an expert in this at all. But I think that the big players are on board. So if I want to speak on behalf of PFAS, for example, it's being heavily regulated in the States, it's being heavily regulated in Europe, but the rumblings are that it's not going to be regulated in some of our developing countries, and so some of the manufacturing is going to move over there. So now we have to be even more careful and conscious about some of our raw materials and what potentially could be happening in these other spaces. So unfortunately, it's not a global thing. Every country has the right to regulate what they want to. The good news is New Zealand is keen, and we also are in a line with Australia as well, so very closely aligned there. But it is a concern, and as someone who maybe is making something or taking something, raw materials from overseas and making a product here in New Zealand, it's time to do due diligence on ask those hard questions about what is in this and trace back all of the different steps.
Great, thank you. I have a question here, probably best answered by Kristelle. Someone's asked, what is the framework or definition for defining good versus bad bacteria?
So bad bacteria is normally considered pathogens. So viruses, bacteria, it can be considered pathogens is normally the bad guys or fungi. And then good bacteria is, think about it like the probiotics that you take for healthy gut health. So all the ads that's been on TV with the good guys and the bad guys and that little seesaw, it works exactly the same as that. We did a test. Hopefully this will help, that we took 2 cell phones, and the one we took, we swabbed it with an ATP tester to tell us what the bacteria count on that is. And I can't quote me on the numbers, but let's say, for instance, it was 100 on the first phone. We swapped the second phone, that phone was, let's say, 110. The first phone we cleaned with alcohol. The second phone we cleaned with probiotics. The count on the first phone that we cleaned with alcohol instantly jumped down to, let's say, 10.5. There was just a few things on it, but it was still coming down. But as soon as you clean with something like alcohol, in that space, it becomes a void space in nature. So everything around it go, ooh, new area for us to grow in, and they just jump on that. Where with the probiotics, as soon as we clean it, it only came down half instantly. And then when we left it for an hour and retested both, the one that was cleaned with alcohol was back up to 100. And the one that was cleaned with the probiotics was down to 3 and 4, because it was coming down slowly because it was eating the pathogens that was on that surface. So it's thinking about keeping the good, we want to keep what is good, what nature gives us, because our probiotic is sourced from soil. So we actually, our probiotics is not genetically engineered or adjusted, whatever. We use a bacillus strain probiotics. It's the strongest strain in nature, and it's a food grade probiotic. So if you decide to drink it, it doesn't taste nice, but nothing will happen because it is a food grade probiotic. We didn't want to go down a synthetic route on this. We wanted to keep it as pure as we possibly can. But if you send me your email address, I can send you amazing studies that's been done in hospitals and all sorts that explains the different bacteria very beautifully.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we will share all the follow-up kind of details in the email and contact details for our speakers. I think we probably just have time for one more question. So we have one here from Kristelle. She says, hi team, I work in the retail industry. Is getting an Oikio text? How did you say it, Cameron?
Oikotex. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it 100% right, but I think,
certification the only way to reduce our chemical footprint, or is there more retailers can do? And that's a great question around what can a sort of average New Zealand business look at doing, or resources they can look at to start tackling that chemical footprint.
Yeah, certainly. And so obviously, depending on the nature of the retail business and what you're actually selling, and whether you're selling textiles or not. So obviously getting things like Oikotex or GOT certification on the textiles that you're importing or bringing in, that will certainly give some assurance that you're at least minimizing. I wouldn't say it's completely eliminating, but at least minimizing the most hazardous compounds that are being used in the production. Probably the biggest thing that you can do as a retailer and even as an individual is looking, as I said, about trying to reduce demand and trying to reuse and recycle at the end of life as much as possible. Because the reality is, I mean, if you're using half as much of something, then the chemical footprint will be half what it was before, even with nothing else changed. And so, it could be a matter of identifying, areas that, particularly areas where you are noticing that there's significant amounts of waste. And thinking about, are there ways that this could be reused or repurposed? Are there people who might accept this as a donation, for example, to be able to reuse those clothing items? Or if they are, say, soiled uniforms or something that people aren't really going to want to reuse as clothing, are there ways that we can maybe engage with the partner to be able to recycle or upcycle some of these materials for other applications? I think that end of life management is definitely going to be key to minimizing some of that impact.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I'll definitely share. SBN has lots of work in this space in the circular economy and product stewardship. So I'll share some resources and links to that stuff as well. Now we just got 5 more minutes. So I'm just going to pass this over to Joya, who's going to just share some info with you about some research that they're conducting.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Kia ora, everyone. Yeah, I'm Joya from the University of Canterbury. I am with Erin in our project team looking at PFAS at a collection of universities, including AUT and University of Auckland. And we're just reaching out in terms of stakeholder engagement and collaboration. We're really, as Erin already mentioned at the end of her wonderful presentation, please reach out to myself or Erin if you want to be involved in our discussions that we have monthly. We're having a good number of people turning up and continual chats and discussion around this, but I'm also keen to hear more formal ways, because we are doing an interview and a survey. So you don't have to participate in both, either or is fine. We'd love your input in terms of your thoughts around PFAS and the knowledge that you have, concerns you have, and just general awareness. So whatever end of the spectrum you're at, whether you know nothing or you know something, or you know everything, please participate in our survey. It should only take about 5 minutes. And we're also really keen to chat to anyone who would love to have a more formal discussion with us. It can obviously be one just around further collaboration, so very informal chat, or a more formal interview where we're just doing some data collection for stakeholder engagement and what kind of the current sentiment around PFAS is in a variety of industries. So we're across the board, whichever industry you're at, we'll be interested to chat to you. So I'm going to pop that information in the link. I hope it comes through okay, and might come through a little messy, but I'm hopefully that's not the case. So yeah, we've got that survey link as well as the interview. If you're interested, pop your email in there, and there's no commitment. Have a read, have a chat to us if you want to know further, but we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And yeah, I'll also include those in that follow-up email. So yeah, one interesting discussion, obviously just scratched the surface of a huge topic, but that's what we're doing in this hot take series, is just starting to expand our knowledge into these kind of different areas in sustainability that I'm hearing about from our network. So if you're part of our network and have a kind of topic you're really interested to hear more about, I will gather some amazing panelists like we had today, and we can dig into it and kind of get to know more about it. So feel free to get in touch with me. My email is just ayla@sustainable.org.nz. And check out, I will be putting this recording up on our YouTube channel, and then you can also have a look at our past hot takes there. But yeah, that's us for today. So I'll just say a huge thank you to our presenters. You're all so excellent, and yeah, I've learned so much today, and obviously by the look of the chat, lots of other people have as well. So thank you so much. Great. Okay, everybody have a lovely rest of your week, and ka kite.
Thank you.
Thanks.